You're listening to the Galaxy Poet Podcast, a new digital platform centered around art, the creative process, and creative solutions to problems facing our world. I am your host, Jordan Ferreira. Let's begin. Welcome to episode 1 of the Galaxy Poet Podcast. I am very excited to be finally working on this project. This is something I've been thinking about doing for about 5 or 6 years. The idea being having an outlet for thought-provoking conversations centered around art, the creative process, the entertainment industry, and also some of the existential issues that I think kind of can have a role with art, and art can kind of play a role in exacting some kind of like proactive change in culture and society. But really anything that kind of falls within the lines of all those things. Those are all things that I'm passionate about. So I'm really looking forward to some of the guests that are lined up, and I'm really excited to be starting this. So this is episode 1. My guest today is Eleanor Goldfield, who is a creative radical journalist and filmmaker. And amongst many other things, she is someone I truly admire because she is all the elements in an artist that I look for in all my favorite kind of creative heroes, whether they be filmmakers, whether they be authors. She's a multi-hyphenate, she's a hybrid artist. She doesn't just make music, she doesn't just make film or write literature. It's sort of this very interesting futuristic blend, which is my favorite thing. That's what I always look for in art, that's what I aspire to. So to have a conversation with Eleanor is really exciting. So I want to get right to the conversation. I want to welcome Eleanor Goldfield.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the beautiful intro.
Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking to you. I enjoy every conversation that we have. And I wanted to start with your film. I think your film is the perfect introduction to you as a creative, as a political activist. All the work that I've seen you do, it is the most concise introduction to you. So I want to say, first of all, it was amazing. Technically, it was masterful. It was beautifully told, and the way it was done, the music, everything, absolutely beautiful. So I have to congratulate you on that. And I have to say also that particularly the second half of the film made me really upset when I saw all of the ways that corporate America kind of consistently puts profit above human life. It was morally bankrupt and utterly reprehensible to me. And my question to you, and there's no other person that I think could answer this the way you can, but what, in your opinion, could people do in their local communities, their environments, to enact the kind of change that's necessary to stop things like this from continuing to happen? Because it's absolutely disgusting and it doesn't seem to be stopping. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, this is kind of like that silver bullet question, right? Like what do we do to save the world? And I think that there's no one answer. I think I'm reminded of the Zapatistas here, and I think it was Subcomandante Marcos who said that we want a world where many worlds are possible. And, in order to get there, we take many different paths. And I think that when we see what works, we have to look at not what ended in the perfect justice and liberation for all, because that's never happened, right? We have to instead look at what has caused the most ire and pushback from the state. So we can look at things like the Zapatistas, we can look at the Black Panther Party, we can look at anarchists and socialists and communists at the turn of the 20th century, things like the Haymarket Affair that gave rise to the labor rights movement in the United States, and that gave rise to the mine wars that's talked about a little bit in the film as well. So I think the important thing to do in local places, particularly in a time right now, where the facades, the sheen of capitalism has been really stripped off of it, and really the ugly face has been laid bare to so many more people. So I think that the important thing to do now is to organize, and whatever that looks like. And I think that, some people some people have gotten irritated with me in the past. They're like, well, what does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know. What does it mean to you? What that looks like in North Carolina is not going to be what it looks like in Seattle, is not going to be what it looks like in Vancouver. And, each place has its different collection of cultures and different needs for the people who live there. So I think that really looks differently for different places. But really the important thing is to get together as community members, whether that be through Zoom or on slightly distant street corners, and talk about what those needs are. And figure out ways to manifest them outside the confines of the system that is clearly not built for us, but built off of our backs. And this is something that we have been shown time and time again. And now is a very I think the ancient Greeks called it kairos, which speaks to this specific time that is perfect for acting. And so I think it's one of those perfect moments now to really dig into that, because we see so blatantly now, more so than other times in our recent history, that the system will not save us. But I can't give you a specific answer, because I think that, again, each place and each group of people are going to do it differently. But I think a good place to start is to look at history and see what got the empire, what got the powers to be to get really scared and to push back violently. And actually, the day that we're recording this, the December 22nd, would have been the 71st birthday of Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, and he was a brilliant human being that was murdered in a military coup that was backed by France. And if you look at some of the things that he was able to do, and some of the things just in 4 years, raise the literacy rate to almost 90% from 13%, and get food to his people, and speak vehemently about feminism and against imperialism. Like, this guy was awesome, and he was murdered. And this is something that happens very, very frequently in the history of these struggles. So instead of looking at what worked, because that's too flat of a way to look at things, instead we should look at what really got the ire of the powers that be.
I think that's a beautiful answer. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I saw that you had posted about that man, and I had looked into him. I confess I'd never heard of him before. And the thing that was astonishing to me is he reminded me so much of my favorite political candidate, which is Bernie Sanders. And the parallels to me were kind of striking, and the fact that he was assassinated with the help of possibly a friend of his that was involved with the French. It's tragic. It's tragic. It makes me wonder if, the current political system that you mentioned, that is designed kind of to be built off of the work of, for example, the working class or whatever it may be. Is there a way in that system to sort of correct the flaws, or in your opinion, is there really more of an incentive to just kind of dismantle what's there and start new?
I think that history shows us that trying to reform something this twisted and sadistic is not going to work. If you look at the bill, at what's been passed, some of us will get $600. Meanwhile, Congress, that's Democrats and Republicans, have agreed to something like $1.35 billion for a border wall. They've agreed to $740 billion for the Pentagon for war. Billionaires have gained almost $1 trillion just during the span of the pandemic, when obviously all of the rest of us have been hurting tremendously. How do you reform that? I don't think you can reform that. Sure, there are things that you can do. You can put back taxes the way they were back in the 50s, when actually the richest of the rich paid almost what they pay here in Sweden, which is like almost 90%, in that bracket. But this is not going to deal with the foundations of capitalism. And this is something that I think is perhaps easier for me, because I grew up between the US and Sweden, to see that, people call Sweden socialist, but it's not. All it has is a bit tighter restraints on capitalism. And it is very much a capitalist system. And today we see in Sweden a lot of the same things happening that are happening in the US, or that had been happening in the 90s, for instance. Sweden is just further behind, but they're unfortunately going in that direction.
Yeah.
And the underlying question is, people talk about an unfettered capitalism, which basically just means that it's not restrained. So if you have this beast that you then try to restrain with a lot of, this, that, and the other thing, the question should really be, but why do we have this beast? Why do we have to have this beast? And it really speaks to a lack of imagination. And it really speaks to, the reason for that lack of imagination is that we're programmed from a very early age across much of the Western world to think that capitalism is it. But really, to quote Richard Wolff, it would be like if you went to a religious studies class, but the only thing they taught you was Catholicism. There are so many other ways to build systems other than capitalism, and it's far past time that we really look at what those are. So I think it's a better use of our time, particularly when you look at climate change, which you can't have green capitalism, because capitalism is based on, extracting resources for profit. I think it's well past time that we look at other options outside of capitalism and stop trying to reform it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's, I want to get to climate change with you because I'm very curious to hear your take on how the political system directly influences like our lack of action, or instability or chaotic kind of financial choices around it. And there's a quote in the film that I wrote down because I don't want to get it exactly right. But I think one of the final interviews that you give is with a local from West Virginia. And he's saying, I don't know if we can fully love the land if we don't directly, if we are not directly sustained from it. I think that's the exact quote. And when I heard that, it made me think of the tremendous disconnect that people have with the things that are important, whether it's the food that they eat, whether it's whatever media they may be consuming. Like, there's a tremendous disconnect. They don't see the factory farms, they don't see the slaughterhouses, they don't see the process and all of that stuff. So what are your thoughts in terms of climate change, which is something I'm incredibly passionate about and have been studying as much as I can? What do you think is the proper approach for people who aren't necessarily in Congress, people who aren't necessarily a public figure? They don't have the platform for saying something, but they want to do something. Like, what do you think would be the correct course of action?
Well, I'd say the first thing is to just disassociate ourselves from the idea that people in Congress will do anything about it. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, I think, famously said about the Green New Deal, the Green Dream or whatever. And this is a Green New Deal that was not stolen, but it was taken from an eco-socialist Green New Deal that was basically transferred from Europe to the United States, and then incredibly watered down to what the current Green New Deal is, that we talk about publicly. But the Green New Deal existed as such long before that, and it's something that I remember Shama Sawant talking about, who's a city council member in Seattle. She was talking about a Green New Deal back in 2015, but she was talking about the eco-socialist Green New Deal, not this watered down version. So I think the first thing is to, as regular people, to say that, to understand that it's actually better that we're not a part of Congress, because Congress is not ever going to do anything to save us. So I think that's the first thing. But the second thing is also to understand the limitations of our personal choices. Of course, I think that you should recycle, but I also think, can I curse on this?
Yeah, you can say whatever you want.
I also think you should wipe your ass when you go to the bathroom. And
Really?
I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to give you like a standing ovation because you did that. It's just something you do as an adult, right? So I think that yes, we should make personal choices that are more sustainable. But I think overwhelmingly we have to recognize things like, for example, there are 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of all emissions in the entire world. 100. And for instance, the US military on its own has the same emissions as 140 countries put together. That's just the military in the US. So to say that by recycling and by using by using a reusable water bottle or whatever, that we're going to save the planet, that really is not going to cut it. And it really speaks to the sort of, again, the propagandization, the programming that we've been subjected to, the idea that, oh, if you want to save the planet, that's on you, but don't bother industry, don't bother the
Right.
plastics industry, don't bother the logging or the big ag industries. Let them do their thing, and you just go ahead and buy yourself a reusable whatever the hell.
Yeah.
But that's not enough. So really, what people have to do is people have to stand in the way of these industries, and sometimes that means physically, and other times that means in other ways. There are dozens, if not, hundreds and thousands of tactics to use against these dirty industries. But I think it's important that we have to recognize that at this point in time, when we have like 5 years before the point of no return, and some scientists say we've already passed it, the time to comfortably address this is over. That's something that should have happened, back in the 80s, when people like Exxon said, yeah, climate change is the thing. But
Right.
that time has passed, and we can no longer comfortably address these issues. So we are going to have to accept that we're going to be uncomfortable. And that, particularly as Americans, if everyone consumed as much as Americans, we would need 5 planets. That's obscene. So we are going to have to consume less, across the board, and we are going to have to consume smarter. And by we, I mean the entirety of humanity. I don't mean that, like, your family needs to eat, more kale. We have to really look at the larger industrial structures that force us into these situations. And part of this is also the capitalist class system. There's a lot of poverty shaming, for instance. Oh, these people bought a bunch of plastic shit at Walmart. Okay, but if you had $20 in your pocket, would you go to Whole Foods or would you go to Walmart? I think
Exactly.
you'd go to Walmart.
Exactly.
So these are all, this is another point of the picture, is that all of these issues are interconnected. We can't talk about climate change unless we talk about income inequality and class issues. And part of that is, of course, racial issues. So we have to recognize that all of these things are interconnected, but we also have to recognize the limitations of our personal choices, and that the machines around us, the machines of the global capitalist system, are really what are killing us. And until we put those in the crosshairs, there's no amount of Paris climate agreements or crap like that that's going to make a difference, because all of those agreements that are made by the powers that be keep those industries intact and uphold them. So that is really what has to be broken down.
Yeah. It's kind of tragic to think about, but I think you're right. I think that is the reality. And what you say about climate and people who, people standing up in their own communities and kind of organizing in their own ways, I think is so real. And it's part of the reason why I have a great appreciation for someone like Greta Thunberg, who I know I've heard certain criticism about. She's not necessarily the go-to vanguard of like climate change data. She's a 16 or 17-year-old Swedish girl. And my thinking is, having been born in the U.S. and seeing the way the culture is kind of gone, like this idol worship that's gone from celebrity, and the celebrities have gotten watered down over decades, to see most people kind of idolize someone like Kendall Jenner and think that's cool, and then to see Greta Thunberg just come out of nowhere and actually be talking about something that matters, that's pretty fucking punk rock to me. Like, so I have an affinity for anyone like that, and her, especially a 17-year-old Swedish girl, standing up to the UN and being like, "You're fucking up. You need to change some shit." To me, that's quite cool.
It is cool, and I think that she did. I think I have criticisms of her too, but I also recognize that at 17, I was not doing that. I was thinking about completely other. I mean, I was involved, like, against I was fighting against the Iraq War and things like that, but
Sure.
I was certainly not. And I think this is this is another thing that I think is important, that we have to recognize, that we have to put things in context. In terms of speaking to the UN, there was, I believe it was Winona LaDuke, who spoke in terms of Indigenous rights to the UN back in the 70s, to speak about how could you possibly own water? How can you possibly, like, this is absurd? And, you know, making that strong connection between indigenous rights and the rights of the planet. And so it's not unusual for youth, particularly indigenous youth, or what people call BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color youth, standing up and saying no, because these communities are the ones that are so often the first in those sacrifice zones, whether that be Cancer Alley or whether that be North Dakota. So I think that, you know, it's important to put this in context. So Grieta is like one of many people, many youth that have stood up and said this. I think it's admirable that she has done this. And I think it's great that people are inspired by that. And I hope that it's a door into learning more about particularly, you know, indigenous and BIPOC led endeavors to address climate justice and racial justice. So I think, you know, whatever gets you inspired and through the door. I went to a climate, I don't call them marches, I call them parades, because a march is not permitted. So I went to the climate parade in New York last year, I guess, and I saw, you know, I talked to some folks, and I talked to some, I'll call them kids. They were like, you know, 14, 15, and they were totally inspired by Grieta. And I think that that's awesome. I think that it's awesome that people that are getting more radicalized at a younger age, and that somebody their age is helping them get there. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there are criticisms, not so much of Grieta, but like of the kind of weird, like, celebrity creepery that grew up around her, and the great white hope weirdness. But I think that, you know, I think it's great for whoever inspires you to walk through that door initially. I think that's awesome. And so, yeah, I definitely appreciate that.
For sure. And that kind of brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about. Like, Greta is one of these figures that I think has, like you said, done some good in introducing a newer generation to kind of these ideas and all that. And I think in a similar way, in politics, AOC is another character which I hear criticisms and I understand that she's still quite young, but I think it's inspiring to me, at least, to see someone who is trying to work in the system and trying to do what seems to me like good work. What are your thoughts on her and some of the things that she's done and all of that?
I mean, just before we got on this call, I read that AOC had voted for $30 million to, you know, to combat socialism in Venezuela. So that was fucked. I also think that her argument about, you know, the force the vote campaign is a stupid one. The idea that we should wait until all the Democrats are on our side. You know, as my dad likes to say, you might as well wait for all the Jews to convert. He's Jewish, so that's not a weird thing to say. I should qualify that.
It's a good thing to know.
But yeah. But so I think that AOC, like, I think this is part of the problem too, is that, you know, with the squad or anything, is that, or even like a Bernie type situation, is we're looking to these people to save us. And part of this is a desperate want for somebody else to deal with this shit so that we don't have to.
True.
Because wouldn't it be nice if our government just did the right thing, like, ever? But the problem is that's not going to happen. And I think that, you know, with AOC, I do not envy her her attempt to find a balance between doing the right thing and staying in Congress or what have you. And I don't pretend to know what's going on in her head, particularly when she says shit like, you know, John McCain was a great human being. But I think that the issue is more so the fact that we are even talking about it, you know, and I think that so many people are caught up in the AOC or the Ilhan Omar or what have you, and letting that steer conversations away from, hey, how are we building community power? How are we basically, as a friend of mine put it, not trying to overthrow the government, but make them obsolete. Because that to me is really the path to liberation and to justice, is to not try to convince the government to do the right thing, not beg them to do the right thing, but to basically build the right thing and use our creative imaginations and use creative tactics to create the change that we want to see. And that can sound trite and kind of like fortune cookie, but I think the bottom line is that someone like AOC or Ilhan Omar, even if they had the power, even if they were president, cannot create the kind of change that we need. And I think that even Bernie said this back in 2016, something to this effect. I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, like, even if I'm president, there's a lot that I can't do. Because unfortunately, the way that the United States government is structured is that some shit does actually have to go through Congress. And going through Congress these days, I mean, it'd be easier to walk on water. So I think that, while I have issues with AOC, they're not enough for me to like lose sleep over or to even get that upset about, because I think that it's not worth spending the time arguing about, because at the end of the day, she's not going to save us, and she's not going to ruin us.
Yeah. And I think that attitude of like approaching it from the standpoint of there is no single politician that's going to fix this. I think that's a really healthy way of looking at this. Perhaps that would have saved quite a lot of time in the climate crisis if we had thought that way, decades ago. But so then my other question, which you sort of answered, but I was going to ask, so then you yourself would never consider entering that arena of the AOC and actually running for Congress? I'd imagine you'd been asked this before.
I have, and one thing is that the amount of dirt that they could drag up about me is just not something that I need, like, my parents or really a lot of other people to see. And not like, it's not really anything that I'm ashamed of. It's just, I mean, I'm not really ashamed of any of it. I mean, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I was 18 to 25 once. But I think that people like me don't get into office, not just because of that, but because I deeply don't believe in it.
Right.
It would kind of be like me becoming a pastor. As an atheist, that wouldn't make much sense.
Yeah.
I don't believe in the American experiment. I believe that it exists, unlike God, but I think that it's a shit show and it didn't work out. Right. And it was never really meant to work out for us. It was meant to work out for the slave owners and for the colonizers and the patriarchy. So I think that me being a part of that in that way would somehow say that I legitimize it and that I believe that it can be a vehicle for liberation. When I fundamentally do not believe that the United States can ever become a place of a land of the free, so to speak.
Right. That's true. That makes sense. And I've even heard other people say that, why would you want to enter the arena of politics when you can enact so much more influence, positive influence, through being an artist? I mean, a successful artist has infinitely more influence, it would seem, than a politician. Although AOC seems to have quite a bit of influence. But I understand that completely. So then, in the documentary, I feel like it's very hard to side with, certain conservative kind of opinions about how capitalism is sort of the greater good, and that it actually, uplifts the quality of living for everyone, including those in poverty and all of that. It's very difficult to kind of agree with that when you see some of the atrocious things that are happening with, for example, like the corrosive materials seeping into the water, and there's no political action whatsoever. If anything, there's an effort to hide, some of what's happening, and the government full well knowing that people are getting cancer and they're developing like kidney failure. So I have a really hard time kind of reconciling, some conservative friends that I have and some of the philosophies that they kind of expound on where capitalism is good. And I get it. I think capitalism has a lot of good things. But it's hard to argue with what you've said, not only in the documentary, but just now, about how the system is really designed for exploitation. Do Do you have any of these dialogues with conservative kind of friends or colleagues or anything like this?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think that, the argument capitalism has done good, the argument is what has capitalism done that another system couldn't do?
Hmm.
And usually the argument is, oh, innovation. And then I'm like, oh, well, then I guess the wheel was created under capitalism. Of course, it wasn't. The idea that human beings can only be innovative under capitalism it's a fallacy, of course, but it's one that's used often to prop up the idea of capitalism. And actually, capitalism is based on competition. But if you look at the groups of people who sit down and make phones and computers or do any of the other innovation that we rely on, they collaborate in order to do that. They work in teams. And they do not compete because otherwise you never have a damn phone. You never have, or you'd have a very, very shitty one because it would be one dude working by himself against another dude across the hall,
Yes.
that kind of shit. So usually the argument is innovation, but it's a false argument, not only historically but presently. And many studies have shown that B corporations and corporations that work under the idea of Dunbar's number, for instance, which are more flat structured because there's not a lot of management, do better, not just financially, but in terms of the health and well-being of their employees, or in terms of co-op, workers and employees are the same people, or sorry, owners and employees are the same people. So that's the issue with that argument. But I'd say, like, at a more foundational point, and I've just stepped into the nerdery there, but like stepping out of the nerdery and just sitting down and having a beer with somebody on a porch in Louisiana or in West Virginia, the conversation usually starts with shit. You don't trust the government, and neither do I. What do you hate about them?
Right.
And I think that, like, and of course the answer is going to be different for everybody, but what we really have to find is, like, where do you draw the line on the people you don't talk to? I don't talk to people who don't believe that I have a right to exist, whether that be because I'm Jewish or queer or a woman or whatever.
Hmm.
If you don't believe that I have a right to exist, then we can't talk. But if you believe that I have not only a right to exist, but I have basic human rights, I think we can find something. And so I've sat down with people who voted for Trump, and I've sat down and been like, okay, what don't you like about the government? Well, it's these damn regulations. Okay, really? Why do you feel that that is? And talk to people, because I think one of the biggest problems is that people don't feel heard. Particularly poor white folks don't feel heard by many people other than, like, the KKK, which
Right.
I don't want poor white people to be heard by the KKK. I want
Sure.
to hear them and I want to organize with them. Um, so I think that it's important to have these conversations. And I wouldn't ask, Black organizers or Indigenous organizers or things like that to have these conversations. I think it really falls on white organizers to do that. But I think that these conversations are really important to have. And I think that when you get a little bit more into, like, that nerdery aspect of why capitalism, I think that you'll find, if you don't name it, like, because I'm not going to walk in there and be like, hey, I'm an anarchist, because then they're going to be like, I'm getting my shotgun. That's
Yeah.
terrifying.
Yeah.
Because they haven't learned what anarchism really is. They've learned about anarchism the way that I did in history books, which makes it sound absolutely fucking terrifying.
Right.
It's akin to the way, like, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, where they say that Jews eat babies. I mean, it sounds absolutely absurd.
But Jews don't eat
So,
babies, right?
I mean, I prefer mine medium rare, but that's just me. Um, but yeah, so I think that, like, when we talk about these things without labeling them, and we say, like, hey, do you really think that you should have to go bankrupt because your wife has cancer or because you have black lung? Like, that's really fucked up, isn't it? And in that moment, I'm basically lambasting capitalism, but I don't say that. I
Yes.
just say, like, this is a really fucked up policy, or this is a really fucked up system that, like, allows that shit to happen. Wouldn't it be better if you just had healthcare? And this is why, like, when Bernie, for instance, did a Fox News town hall and they asked the crowd, would you like universal healthcare? People cheered and they had to cut to commercial because that shit was super embarrassing for Fox. But their viewers were like, yeah, I want socialist shit. Like, because of course, when you just say it outright what it is, which is your tax dollars paying for you to not die, that sounds good. But when you say it's a socialist scam, of course, a lot of people are going to be like, ah. So
Yes.
I think that, it matters how we talk about these things and it matters how we talk to people. And I think that this is another problem that folks on the left do have is that they talk down to people who
True.
haven't had the privilege of a good education. And in the United States, that's a lot of people who haven't had the privilege of a good education. And so I think that it's not about dumbing yourself down just the way that I don't dumb myself down when I speak Swedish. I don't dumb myself down when I speak French. I'm just speaking differently. And it's the same thing when I go into, the hills and hollers of West Virginia. I don't talk the way that I do when I'm doing like a talk at a university. It's just a different way of speaking. But it's a way of speaking that allows me to have these conversations with people so that they actually feel heard and that I can learn something too. So it's not it's a mutualism as well. It's not the idea that I'm going to go down there and tell these people about the joys of anarchism or something. I'm going to have a dialogue with them.
Yeah.
And I want to listen to what they need because I want to organize and help them get what they need outside the confines of the system.
Yeah. Beautifully said. And it's funny that you mentioned Bernie Sanders and some of the problems with the left because I've always felt that from the beginning, the branding as a democratic socialist was not going to end well. Like the word socialism. I mean, if he were to brand himself as an ethical capitalist or something like that, I mean, I feel like that would have been way better. But I kind of admire the fact that he's like, it's what it is. That's what I call it. Like he doesn't, you know what I mean? There was no filter and no attempt to kind of like soften the message or the philosophy. So at the same time, that's kind of what makes me love him. But yeah, I do notice that. And I do notice that, yeah, there seems to be a huge problem of hypocrisy on the left, which I think is a huge issue and needs to be addressed. Like so many of the candidates, I mean, particularly, like, I think Biden is a good example, although I supported him, and the first time I've ever voted in a presidential election. I've been apolitical my entire life. But supporting him solely because, I couldn't just sit on the sidelines and watch, like, this spoiled billionaire kind of completely derail civilization, because it seemed to me that's sort of what was happening in some ways. Um,
And
but
Biden is not the spoiled billionaire.
But he sort of is, yeah, that's what I mean. So they brand him as kind of the savior. And look, I supported him. I certainly did. And I think he was the only sane choice in this kind of insane system. But yeah, it's crazy how all those things that all the bills that he proposed that were, I guess, for gang, the kind of, Kamala Harris, I think, her record was kind of criticized for being most responsible for imprisoning the most black, most which is reprehensible, and it's something she should be held to account on. But in an insane system where you have two insane options, it's very, it's very complex and confusing. But I think what you say is sort of a relief of that system. It's sort of like once you abandon that idea and you accept the fact that your responsibility is to do your part, then I think the problem somehow becomes more manageable, even though it seems counterintuitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'd first start by saying that in terms of like what I'm talking about when I say left, Biden is not left.
Mm.
Biden is a neoliberal piece of shit, and that's me being nice. He's a racist, sexist, rapist, dirty old man,
Mm.
and that's also pretty nice. He's a war hawk.
Mm.
He's a horrible human being, and I think that. And I'm not going to do the vote shaming thing because the shit's over and it doesn't matter.
Sure.
But I would like to see how people who voted for Biden and expect change will feel after a year or 2 years or 3 years or however long he can clutch on to life. Um, and I think that, the issue is, yeah, you have two absurd choices. But if somebody offered me to eat a pile of shit and eat vomit, I think I'd say, you know what, I'll just fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that the other thing is that there are other options, there are other parties that do run, and people say, oh, it's a waste of time to vote for them because they're not going to win.
Hmm.
Well, okay, then write in Mickey Mouse. I don't know. I mean, the way that I feel about electoral politics is basically like, when it comes to local elections, they matter.
Right.
Because a lot can be done locally. I mentioned Shama Sawant earlier, and she's done incredible things in terms of dealing with Seattle from a socialist perspective and through a socialist lens. But the idea that, and this is why, I mean, Bernie was never going to be allowed, even if he called himself like a
Some.
happy capitalist.
Yeah.
He was never going to be the pick of the Democrats, because the Democrats knew exactly who they needed to be heading that party, and that was not someone like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And if you look at history, this is something that the parties have done for a long time. They've protected their platforms, which are platforms that speak to U.S. empire and speak to profit over people at all costs. So this is not anything new. But
Yeah.
Biden is the zombie corpse of the Democratic platform that is desperately trying to cling on to some semblance of importance in the face of catastrophe after catastrophe, where people are, continuing to see that the Democrats don't give a flying fuck about them.
Sure.
And so I think that, there is a problem. There are problems on the left, and by that I mean not the Democrats. The Democrats are basically Republicans. If you look at what the Republicans were in the 80s, that's basically the Democrats today. So we don't have a left and a right party in the United States. We have two right-wing parties. One of them is interesting, dangerously close to fascism, but as Ajama Baraka pointed out, neoliberalism leads to fascism. So the idea that you can have a neoliberal party like the Democrats that doesn't lead to Trump is silly. And I think that we're going to see that whatever Biden does is going to cause a blowback that is even worse than Trump. And that is actually scary, because Trump might be a bumbling idiot that can't even tie his own shoes. But somebody like Pence certainly knows how to not only tie his shoes, but destroy the entire world. So I think that it's very important that we recognize who's creating the situations that we are told to fear. Who's creating the situations like Trump. Trump wasn't born in a vacuum. He didn't rise in a vacuum. Obama's policies were worse than Bush's. Under Obama, black folks suffered far more than they had under Bush. Obama bombed more people than Bush. Obama was the person who started putting kids in cages. So these policies are not something that Trump made up. They're something that Trump inherited. And so I think it's very important to put those things in context and thereby understand that electoral politics, particularly on a federal level, and that includes Congress, is not going to save us. It's not even going to give a shit whether we live or die. More so than the fact that we could, possibly help them buy another yacht through our labor. But yeah, so I think and that's when I say the left, I mean like the actual left, what people who might call themselves socialists or communists or anarchists, or people who might not label themselves as anything, but who believe in the basic human rights of people, and who believe in justice, not just in terms of climate justice, but justice for all living things. So I think that is the left that I'm talking about, and the Democrats are not at all emblematic of that. And I think that people might not want to call themselves left, and that's totally cool. But again, that kind of circles back to the earlier point that you can call it Bob if you really want to. Let's just sit down and talk about what we need. And this is why the issue of action is so important. When we're running mutual aid and doing a community garden, I don't ask a dude who walks in with a shovel if he's an anarchist. I just say, oh, cool, shovel, let's plant something. And I think that
Yeah.
this is this is the power of action. And I will totally sit down and nerd out with anybody about political philosophy or anything like that any day. But I think when it actually comes to, to building the world that we want to see and fighting for our basic human rights, then it doesn't matter what you call it. And a lot of people won't call it anything just because they haven't or don't want to read all of the shit that I like reading.
Yeah.
But the core principles are the same, and nobody needs to be told what oppression feels like. We can all feel it, and as long as
Yes.
we can find those threads and pull those threads together, then I think that we can find that common ground to build something better.
Agreed. Yeah, perfectly said. And I think it's funny that you mention, Bernie Sanders, someone like Bernie Sanders historically never really having a shot to win the presidency. Because I remember during the primary, you were the person that I was texting saying, when he won Iowa, when he won all of the primaries and the Iowa caucus, I was telling you, like, it looks like he's going to win it. It really does. It looks promising. And you're like, it's never going to happen. It's not going to happen. Watch what happens. And you were right. And particularly the way the DNC handled that, I think, is disgusting. I think is absolutely disgusting. Tom Morello said on Instagram that if what was done in the U.S. that night was done in Venezuela, we'd be sending in a coup to kind of claim the government. And I think that's absolutely true. And it's kind of horrifying that it was meant as like it's a joke, but it's really not a joke. It's kind of
We have
terrifying.
one of the most undemocratic electoral systems in the entire world. We don't even let election observers in anymore because we
Yeah.
hate what they say. Whereas somewhere like Venezuela, for instance, has many election observers, and they've found Venezuela to be one of the most democratic systems in the world, despite what the New York Times and other bullshit rags call it. So, yeah, I mean, the electoral system is a total sham. I mean, everything from, kicking voters off the voting rolls if they, commit the cardinal sin of being black or Latinx, to the black box voting machines, to the fact that if, the mail-in voting system that was completely wrecked on purpose during this, particular election when people were trying to avoid standing in line at the polls. The entire thing is just one giant fuck you to the concept of democracy and the concept of one person, one vote.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, I mean, the primaries, actually, if you look at the primaries, the Republicans actually have a more democratic primary system than the Democrats do. So,
They do, and that's how Donald Trump was able to win the nomination, right? I mean,
mhm.
there's more stringent demands on the Democratic side, which I thought was confusing. But you're right.
Well, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz said it back in 2016, and I assume that she didn't mean for this to slip out of her face hole, but she said that the reason that we have these rules in place is so that activists can't run for office. So the
Wow.
Democrats are well aware of why they do the things that they do. And actually, in a court case after Bernie was after the primary was stolen from Bernie, the DNC admitted to rigging it in a
Right.
court case. And they said that, well, it's our right to rig it.
Yeah.
And anybody who votes for the Democrats should know that that's what we do. So it's really your fault, dumb voters, that you don't know better. So this is their perspective. And this is why, one of the, reason 14,500,000 for why reforming the system is, in my opinion, a fool's errand. And you'd have better luck trying to break down the White House by banging your head against the door. I mean, it's just not. It's not a useful. It's not a good use of time or energy.
I think the president is trying that right now, so we should have more data in a few days. um, yeah, it's true. I agree with everything you said, and I actually want to ask you about like your introduction to your political kind of philosophies and your passionate kind of work in mutual aid and volunteer work and all of this stuff. Like, because the Eleanor that I met in LA, I became a fan of the recording artist, the performer. And I didn't even necessarily know that you were, I mean, I knew that obviously there was a political thread in your music, but I didn't know that you had done any of these things. So did you first kind of fall in love with literature and then that led you to some of these political things, or was it music that led you to literature? How did that work?
Um, I actually, this is one of those things that a lot of people don't know. I was a big Guns N' Roses fan as a child. And people know that, but they don't know that one of the first songs that I listened to that I like felt really moved by was Civil War. Um, and that line at the end where he's speaking and he says, "What's so civil about war anyway?" And my father's a historian who specializes in the Civil War. And I remember playing that song for him, and he said, "Yeah, that's a good song." Uh, and so it got me digging into because not only does my dad, who I wanted to impress, not only does David think it's cool, but Axl Rose thinks it's cool. Holy shit! Uh, so it got me digging into ideas, and I think I think I've been very lucky. Both of my parents are politically engaged. My dad marched on Washington during the Vietnam War. My mom. Um, Organized against nuclear energy and things like that, both in Sweden and in the US. So I think I grew up with this concept of giving a shit about the world around you in terms of, being politically engaged. And then it just sort of, from there, music definitely helped. And I think, not just, of course, Guns N' Roses is no political band. But from there, I fell into other music, not least of all like Rage Against the Machine and things like that. But I think what got me sort of more radicalized was, so I started with environmental work when I was like probably 15 or so. And then prior to the second Iraq War in 2003, I was doing anti-war work. Um, and then I remember in March 2003 when they bombed Baghdad, and I remember picking up the phone and my dad saying to me he was calling me from somewhere, and I picked up the phone in the kitchen and he said they just started bombing Baghdad. And my first response was, they didn't listen to us? They don't care that the people didn't want war? I am flabbergasted. I really couldn't believe that the powers that be just ignored the fact that, millions of people around the world, in Australia and fucking everywhere, people were marching saying no to the Iraq War. And the US didn't care. And I was so shocked by this. And this kind of like started a ball rolling in terms of understanding the depth of not giving a fuck that our system really has when it comes to the will of the people. And that brought me to, books like I think a very pivotal book was Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Another one was Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Anything by Chris Hedges, really. These books really solidified that understanding that the system not only doesn't care, but actively crushes and tries to silence those who do care. Um, and also, it helped me understand that all of these things are connected. Like, I used to think that environmentalism was over here and then anti-war was over here. And, but then I really understood that all of these things are interconnected and why it's so important to treat them as such. So I'd say that in terms of art, I absolutely think that I would not be who I am in terms of politics if it weren't for artists who spoke up. And this is something that I folded into my own art, of course, because I think it's very insidious. Like if you hand someone a spreadsheet and they be like, "Look at the numbers of the Pentagon spending," everyone's going to be like, "Ah, God."
Yeah, I don't want to
Um,
fucking do that.
right? But if you sing a song about fuck
Right.
war, that's powerful, and people are headbanging, and before they know it, they're singing along to something that is vehemently anti-war and anti-imperialist. Art is a backdoor to people's psyche. It hits us emotionally. It hits us in the soul before we have a chance to logically try to reason it away or something like that. So I think that that particularly as a kid growing up and hearing that and seeing, I remember seeing Guernica in one of my mom's art books because my mom's an artist. I remember seeing
Yeah.
Guernica as a kid, the Picasso piece, and thinking, "Holy shit, that's intense." And so being exposed to a lot of this kind of art as a kid is absolutely why I one of the big reasons why I am who I am today in terms of being radicalized.
That's fascinating. And what an amazing, like, unique, singular experience. I think that that's incredible. Like to yeah, to be active politically at 15 years old and to be passionate about these things at a very early age and to be like curious about the lyrics in a Guns N' Roses song and why is it called Civil War and investigating Rage Against the Machine, and I think that's really really punk rock and really cool. Yeah, so I guess that kind of leads to a question I wanted to ask you about art's role in kind of being a spark to ignite like a social change and change culture for the better. Like, what do you see as being art's role, across all artistic mediums? In what ways can art propel that cultural change that needs to happen?
So art, I oftentimes say, because I do trainings and things on about like creative activism and creative radicalism. And one of the things that I say is that art is not going to topple empires. So let's just be clear about that. But art will inspire the people who do.
Mm.
And I think that the thing with art is that it requires creative thinking. And that might sound like, okay, duh. But if you think about it, the way that people are programmed is to not think creatively, right? We're taught to think linearly, and we're taught to think in like spreadsheets and shit like that in schools. In schools, it's always the art classes that get cut first, art and music, and then it's like history and English. But math and science, don't you fucking dare touch those, right?
Yeah.
Nothing against math and science, like total respect for people who can add and stuff. But it's the idea of thinking creatively is something that is beaten out of a lot of children
Yes.
and adults, and that's done on purpose. And I think that it's so important to recognize that as part of the problem, because, for instance, like to take an old cliche, uh, you know, non-creative thinking will have people rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. But creative thinking will have people breaking apart those fucking deck chairs and building some goddamn rafts.
Yes.
And and that's the difference, right? It's like, how are we going to address these horrific issues that face us in this particular time that have not faced humans, not
Right.
to this scale? How do we deal with this? Well, we sure as shit can't deal with it with what we've been taught in econ class.
Yeah.
We have to address this through creative means, and art is a way to do that. Art is creative thinking. Art is creative tactics. Art is creative projects. And also, even just more on a very base level, the idea that art is the salve for the soul, but it is also that primal scream that people can relate to regardless of where they're from or what they do or what have you. I
Yes.
mean, there's a reason that people have religious like experiences at concerts. There's a reason that people can stand in front of a painting or something like that, or a video for hours and be totally entranced.
Yeah.
Um, I think that it is it is so important to recognize the power of art in terms of our ability to keep going. It is an outlet for those who need to speak their truth, but it is also a way for us to recognize that others have spoken this truth and that we're not alone.
Yeah.
Something that Patoka calls the solidarity of the shaken. We don't like the saying "no gods, no masters." When you recognize that there are no gods and no masters that will hold your hand through this abyss, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
But you have each other, and I know that sounds trite, but literally, like millions of us that don't have any gods or masters, we have each other, and that's shaky ground, but it's that solidarity of the shaken that Patoka talks about. And so I think that like art is a way to put out that message that we're not alone and that we're going to be able to get through this and we can do this. And of course, again, a way to lessen that load for yourself. And so I think that like the power of art cannot be diminished either through like just the base idea of, you know, creating it, or really the creative thinking that has to do with how we're going to survive. And I'll also say like consider any consider any progress that humans have ever made. There's been an art component. You know, whether that be the you know the signs that that folks marched with in the civil rights era that said "I am man."
Hmm.
That's just such a powerful message, but it's a very graphically powerful message as well.
Yeah.
You know, the banners that were held in the Vietnam era, the way that, you know, posters were made in the suffragette movement, all this kind of shit. There's no such thing as a movement that doesn't have an art component, that doesn't have a creative component. And so I think that that's incredibly important to recognize. And I'll say one more thing about that. You know, there's a reason why Indigenous peoples in the United States weren't allowed to do ceremony, and sing songs and do their dances because they were considered to be dangerous to, you know, the colonizers. And the reason that they were dangerous is because they fucking fired people up and they
Yeah.
connected to them to something deeper, something that can't be explained with, you know, our Western, so-called Western data points. You know, there
Yeah.
is something deep that you can connect to when you engage in art, when you engage in and I would call it in the ceremony of art. You know, because you know what you're on stage and I see the way that you play and shit. Like there's some ceremony happening, whatever the fuck that is, and people want to be a part of that, and people get fired up when they engage with that. And
Yeah.
so I think that, you know, that yeah, that to me is like a perfect example of the danger of art and the power of art.
It's beautifully said. I think that's an inspiring note to end on. I mean, I don't think there's anything I could add to that. But before we go, I just want to encourage anyone who may be watching this who's interested in some of the subject matter we've been talking about, whether it's, you know, social injustice, the climate crisis. Eleanor's film, Hard Road of Hope, is available on hardroadofhope.com. And I want to bring up the site. This is where you can purchase it. You can see some of the accolades that Eleanor's got both nationally and internationally. And yeah, I'm really, really happy to have had the chance to talk to you. And thank you for doing this. And I hope to speak to you again. I hope you're safe. And yeah, thank you, Eleanor. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you soon. That was an incredibly inspiring conversation with Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor is someone I've looked up to for a very long time. I hope to have many more conversations with her on The Galaxy Poet. If you'd like to support the podcast, my PayPal and Venmo information are here. This helps me keep the podcast running smoothly and invite more, you know, interesting, captivating, enchanting creatives. Thank you for joining us on the Galaxy Poet podcast. This is going to be a consistent podcast with one coming out every week, ideally. This is something I'm really excited about to explore in the future, different guests from different walks of life, different creatives, different people involved in different political spheres, different political spectrums, people of all beliefs, all different kind of creeds. I think that's a really exciting concept, especially now with COVID, especially now because contact is so minimal and isolation and things like this are so common. I think this is an exciting forum for conversation. So I want to thank you for being part of it. Hope to see you at the next one. Bye.